In the annals of human conflict, no war has ever been fought with such devastating aerial power as World War II. Above the battlefields of Europe, the Pacific, and North Africa, massive bombers carved their deadly paths through hostile skies, carrying within their aluminum bellies the power to level entire cities and change the course of history forever. These were not merely machines of war. They were flying fortresses, crewed by young men barely out of their teens, who climbed into their cockpits knowing that statistically, they might never see home again. The bombers of World War II didn't just drop explosives. They carried the hopes, fears, and desperate strategies of entire nations. Tonight, we journey into the cockpits of the most lethal bombers ever built. From the legendary British Lancaster that terrorized the Reich, to the American flying fortress that ruled the daylight skies, to the feared German Stuka that revolutionized warfare itself. These are their stories. Stories of engineering brilliance, tactical innovation, and the extraordinary courage of the men who flew them into the jaws of death. Our story begins in the factories of Britain, where in 1941, a bomber was born that would become synonymous with the Royal Air Force's relentless night offensive against Nazi Germany. The Avro Lancaster, a name that still sends shivers down the spine of anyone who understands what it meant to wage war from 20,000 feet above enemy territory. What made the Lancaster special wasn't just its size or its bomb-carrying capacity, though it could carry an astounding 22,000 pounds of ordnance, more than any other bomber of its era. No, what made the Lancaster legendary was something far more profound. It was a bomber that worked. In a war where complexity often meant failure, the Lancaster's designers at Avro chose simplicity, ruggedness, and reliability. Picture this. It's 2 a.m. on a cold November night in 1943. Across the airfields of Lincolnshire, the sound of Merlin engines warming up fills the darkness. 7 young men, average age just 22, are settling into their positions aboard a Lancaster bound for Berlin. The pilot, Flight Sergeant Williams, has already survived 12 missions. In RAF Bomber Command, that makes him practically ancient. The statistics were brutal. During the height of the bombing offensive, a bomber crew had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving their required 30-mission tour. Yet night after night, these Lancaster crews climbed aboard their aircraft, knowing full well that death was not just possible, it was probable. But the Lancaster gave them something precious, a fighting chance. Its geodetic construction, pioneered by the brilliant Barnes Wallis, could absorb punishment that would have destroyed other aircraft. Lancasters returned to base with massive holes in their fuselages, engines shot away, control surfaces shredded by flak and fighter attacks. Yet they kept flying, kept bringing their crews home. The Lancaster's most famous moment came on the night of May 16, 1943, when 19 specially modified aircraft took off on what would become known as the Dambusters Raid. Flying at treetop level through heavily defended valleys, these Lancasters delivered Barnes Wallis's revolutionary bouncing bombs against the Ruhr dams. It was precision bombing at its most audacious and most dangerous. Of those 19 Lancasters, 8 never returned. 56 brave airmen died that night. But the raid proved something crucial, that British bombers could strike with surgical precision at the very heart of Nazi industrial power. The Lancaster had announced itself not just as a weapon of mass destruction, but as an instrument of precision warfare. By war's end, Lancasters had flown over 156,000 sorties, dropping more than 608,000 tons of bombs on Nazi targets. They helped reduce German industrial capacity by an estimated 40%. But numbers tell only part of the story. The real measure of the Lancaster's impact was in the terror it struck in the hearts of ordinary Germans, who learned to dread the sound of those 4 Merlin engines passing overhead in the darkness. Before the Lancaster earned its legendary status, another British bomber was already prowling the night skies over Europe, pioneering the very concept of strategic night bombing. The Vickers Wellington, affectionately known as the Wimpy to its crews, would prove that sometimes revolutionary engineering can mean the difference between life and death at 15,000 feet. What made the Wellington extraordinary wasn't immediately obvious to the casual observer. From the outside, it looked like any other twin-engine bomber of its era. But beneath that conventional exterior lay one of the most innovative structural designs in aviation history. the geodetic framework conceived by the brilliant engineer Barnes Wallis. Imagine, if you will, a basket, not made of wicker, but of aluminum alloy, with thousands of interlocking triangular sections forming a web of incredible strength. This was the Wellington's secret weapon, a structure so resilient that it could absorb damage that would have sent any conventional aircraft spinning toward Earth in flames. Flight Lieutenant John Morrison discovered this firsthand on a cold February night in 1941. His Wellington had been caught by a Messerschmitt 110 over the North Sea, its twin engines raking the bomber's fuselage with cannon fire. By all rights, Morrison's aircraft should have disintegrated. Instead, the geodetic structure held. Massive holes gaped in the Wellington's skin, but the underlying framework kept the aircraft flying. It was like flying inside a skeleton, Morrison would later recall. You could see stars through the holes, feel the wind howling through the cabin, but that remarkable airframe just wouldn't quit. The Wellington flew on for another hour, crossing the channel with Morrison fighting to keep her level. When they touched down at their home base, ground crews counted over 300 bullet and cannon holes. Any other bomber would have been a tomb for its crew. The Wellington had become their salvation. This resilience made the Wellington the backbone of RAF Bomber Command's early night offensive against Germany. From September 1940 onward, Wellingtons led the charge into heavily defended German airspace, their crews learning the deadly art of night navigation while German fighters and flak batteries learned to fear the sound of their approach. The Wellington crews faced a unique kind of warfare, psychological as much as physical. Flying alone through hostile darkness, navigating by dead reckoning and the occasional glimpse of a landmark, they carried the war directly to German soil when Britain stood alone against the Nazi war machine. These men, and they were mostly just boys really, developed an almost mystical bond with their aircraft. They knew that their survival depended not just on their skill, but on the integrity of Barnes Wallis's revolutionary design. Night after night, battered Wellingtons limped home on one engine, their geodetic skeletons holding together despite damage that defied belief. By 1943, as the four-engine heavies took over the strategic bombing role, the Wellington found new life in other theaters. Over the Mediterranean, in North Africa, and in the Far East, Wellingtons continued their deadly work, proving their versatility beyond the original night bombing role. But it was in those dark early years of the war, when Britain's survival hung by a thread, that the Wellington truly earned its place in history. It kept the flame of resistance burning when all seemed lost, carrying the fight to the enemy when no other option remained. Across the Atlantic, American aircraft designers were developing a very different approach to strategic bombing. While the British embraced the cover of darkness, the United States Army Air Forces believed in something far more audacious: daylight precision bombing. To execute this revolutionary doctrine, they needed a bomber that could fight its way to the target and back in broad daylight. They needed the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Sound of multiple engines, distinctly different from British aircraft. The name itself was both marketing genius and tactical doctrine rolled into one. Flying Fortress. It promised defensive firepower that could hold off enemy fighters while delivering bombs with unprecedented precision. And in the hands of skilled crews, flying in tight defensive formations, that's exactly what it became. Picture this scene. It's October 14th, 1943, a date that would become known in USAF history as Black Thursday. 350 B-17s are climbing through the morning sky over England, bound for the Schweinfurt ball-bearing factories deep in Germany. Each aircraft carries a crew of 10 men, their average age barely 21. They know they're flying into the teeth of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter pilots, with minimal escort coverage. What they don't know is that they're about to face the most devastating aerial battle in the history of strategic bombing. By day's end, 60 B-17s will be shot down, 600 American airmen killed or captured. But the remainder will press on to their target, deliver their bombs with devastating accuracy, and prove once and for all that daylight strategic bombing was not just possible, it was inevitable. The B-17's secret weapon wasn't just its 13.50 caliber machine guns, though that defensive armament was formidable enough to give German fighter pilots serious pause. No, the real innovation was the combat box formation. a three-dimensional defensive arrangement that allowed B-17s to provide mutual fire support while maintaining bombing accuracy. Technical Sergeant James Stevens, a ball turret gunner with the 306th Bomb Group, described the experience. "You're hanging there in that plexiglass bubble 30,000 feet above Germany, watching Messerschmitts coming straight at you like angry hornets. But you know that somewhere above you, your buddies in the other fortresses are watching your back, just like you're watching theirs." The psychological pressure was unimaginable. These young men were locked in aluminum tubes for missions lasting 8 to 10 hours, much of it over heavily defended enemy territory. They faced flak so thick you could allegedly walk on it, fighter attacks that could turn a bomber into a fireball in seconds, and the constant knowledge that a single mechanical failure could mean death for the entire crew. Yet they kept flying. The B-17 gave them something beyond defensive firepower. It gave them confidence. The aircraft's reputation for bringing crews home, despite horrific battle damage, became legendary. Fortresses returned to base with engines shot away, tail sections nearly severed, control cables held together by will and prayer. Time and again, the B-17's rugged construction and redundant systems saved lives. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the B-17 was how it transformed warfare itself. For the first time in history, an enemy's industrial heartland was under constant attack in broad daylight. German workers couldn't ignore the war. It was literally falling from the sky above their factories. The psychological impact was enormous. Every B-17 formation that appeared over German cities was a reminder that American industrial might was now fully engaged in the war. The sight of those silver bombers, flying in perfect formation through walls of flak, was both terrifying and oddly beautiful. A deadly ballet performed at 25,000 feet. By 1944, as long-range escort fighters finally arrived to protect the bomber formations, the B-17's mission evolved from survival to systematic destruction. The combined bomber offensive, as it came to be known, began dismantling German war production with methodical precision. Oil refineries, aircraft factories, transportation networks, all fell victim to the deadly accuracy of B-17 bombardiers. The Flying Fortress had proven that strategic bombing could indeed win wars, but only at a cost that staggers the imagination. 4,750 B-17s lost in combat, nearly 47,000 American airmen killed or captured. Not every bomber was designed to level cities or destroy industrial complexes. Sometimes, warfare demands versatility, adaptability, and the ability to strike unexpected targets in unexpected ways. For such missions, the United States turned to a medium bomber that would become synonymous with tactical innovation and sheer audacious courage: the North American B-25 Mitchell. Named after aviation pioneer Billy Mitchell, the B-25 was designed as a workhorse, reliable, adaptable, and capable of operations from improvised airfields across the globe. But it was destined to achieve immortality in one of the most daring raids in military history. April 18, 1942, the aircraft carrier USS Hornet is pitching through heavy seas 650 miles from the Japanese coast. On her deck, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, aircraft never designed for carrier operations, are preparing for takeoff. Their mission: strike the Japanese mainland in retaliation for Pearl Harbor, in an operation so audacious that many consider it impossible. The man leading this mission, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, knows that his bombers are taking off on a one-way trip. The B-25s don't have enough fuel to return to the carrier. The plan is to fly onto airfields in China after bombing Japan. If anything goes wrong, if the weather doesn't cooperate, if the Japanese fleet intercepts them, there are no backup plans. At 8:20 a.m., Doolittle's B-25 lurches down the Hornet's deck, fighting for altitude as it clears the carrier's bow with mere feet to spare. One by one, 15 more Mitchells follow, each takeoff a testament to pilot skill and aircraft capability. No twin-engine bomber had ever taken off from a carrier deck before. The B-25 was writing aviation history with every revolution of its propellers. The raid itself lasted only minutes. Doolittle's raiders struck Tokyo, Kobe, Yokohama, and Nagoya with surgical precision, then disappeared into the vastness of the Pacific. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan, the island fortress that had seemed invulnerable, had been struck at its very heart by American bombers. But the Doolittle raid was just the beginning of the B-25's remarkable war service. From the steaming jungles of the Southwest Pacific to the frozen mountains of the Aleutians, from the deserts of North Africa to the Italian peninsula, Mitchell bombers adapted to every conceivable combat role. In the Pacific, B-25s pioneered skip bombing, flying at masthead height to skip bombs off the water into the sides of Japanese ships like deadly stones. It was incredibly dangerous, requiring pilots to fly through walls of anti-aircraft fire at altitudes where any hit meant certain death. Yet B-25 crews mastered this technique, sinking hundreds of Japanese vessels in attacks that redefined naval warfare. Captain Robert "Pappy" Boyington, better known for his fighter ace exploits, once flew as a passenger in a B-25 skip bombing attack. His description captures the sheer terror and exhilaration. "We came in so low I could see the expressions on the Japanese sailors' faces. The pilot held that Mitchell steady as a rock while flak bursts shook us like a leaf. When we released, the ship seemed to jump up and meet our bombs. It was the most incredible piece of flying I ever witnessed." In Europe, B-25s proved equally adaptable. Flying from bases in England, North Africa, and later Italy, Mitchell struck everything from bridges and railroad yards to airfields and supply depots. Their ability to operate from rough, improvised airstrips made them invaluable for tactical support operations. The B-25's versatility extended beyond bombing. Mitchell served as reconnaissance aircraft, gunships, and even experimental platforms for new weapon systems. Some were modified with massive 75mm cannons for anti-shipping work. Others bristled with machine guns for ground attack missions. What made all this possible was the B-25's fundamental design philosophy: rugged simplicity. Unlike some bombers that required perfect conditions and expert maintenance, the Mitchell could operate from dirt strips in New Guinea as easily as concrete runways in England. It was a bomber built for war, not for peacetime demonstration flights. By war's end, nearly 10,000 B-25s had been built, serving with distinction in every theater of operations. They had proven that medium bombers, properly employed, could be every bit as war-winning as their larger, more famous cousins. While the B-17 Flying Fortress captured headlines and imagination, another American heavy bomber was quietly becoming the most produced bomber in history. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, ungainly in appearance, challenging to fly, but possessing capabilities that made it indispensable to the Allied war effort. The B-24 suffered from what we might call an image problem. Where the B-17 was sleek and graceful, the Liberator was angular and utilitarian. Crews called it the flying coffin, or the crate the B-17 came in. But those same crews who cursed its handling characteristics came to appreciate its incredible versatility and range. The B-24's secret weapon was its Davis wing, a high aspect ratio design that gave the Liberator significantly better fuel efficiency and range than the B-17. This meant Liberators could reach targets that other bombers simply couldn't touch, and they could carry heavier bomb loads over longer distances. August 1, 1943, Benghazi, Libya. In the pre-dawn darkness, 177 B-24 Liberators are preparing for takeoff on what will become known as the Ploesti Raid, one of the most ambitious and costly bombing missions of the entire war. Their target, the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania, which supplied nearly one-third of Nazi Germany's aviation fuel. The mission profile was unlike anything attempted before. A 2,400-mile round trip, flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, striking one of the most heavily defended targets in occupied Europe. The planners knew it would be costly. They didn't know it would become one of the most heroic disasters in aviation history. Colonel John "Killer" Kane, leading the 98th Bomb Group, watched his formation approaching the target at 200 feet altitude. The intelligence reports had been wrong, terribly wrong. Instead of finding the refineries lightly defended, the Liberators flew into a wall of flak so intense it seemed impossible that anything could survive. But they pressed on, flying through explosions that rocked their aircraft like toys, dodging balloon cables and flak towers. The B-24 crews delivered their bombs with devastating accuracy. The refineries erupted in flames that could be seen for 50 miles. But the cost was horrific. 54 liberators shot down, 532 American airmen killed or captured. Yet the mission proved something crucial about the B-24. When properly employed, it could reach targets that no other bomber could touch. The Liberator's range and payload capacity made it the perfect weapon for strategic missions across the vast expanses of the Pacific and the extended supply lines of the European theater. In the Pacific, B-24s found their true calling. Operating from bases scattered across thousands of miles of ocean, Liberators struck Japanese installations from the Aleutians to the Philippines. Their ability to carry extra fuel tanks meant they could reach targets deep in Japanese-held territory, bringing the war home to an enemy that had thought distance was their protection. The 42nd Squadron, operating from primitive bases in the Central Pacific, developed what they called milk run missions, routine bombing flights that could last 12 to 14 hours, much of it over empty ocean where any mechanical failure meant death. These crews learned to trust their Liberators completely, knowing that the aircraft's redundant systems and rugged construction were literally their lifeline. But perhaps the B-24's most important contribution was in roles that never made headlines. Liberators served as maritime patrol aircraft, hunting German U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic. They flew supply missions over the hump between India and China, keeping Chinese resistance alive. They conducted photo reconnaissance missions that provided crucial intelligence for Allied operations. This versatility came at a price. The B-24 was notoriously difficult to fly, especially in formation. Its high wing loading and sensitive controls made it challenging for inexperienced pilots. Many crews preferred the forgiving flight characteristics of the B-17, even though the Liberator offered superior performance in almost every measurable category. But for those who mastered its quirks, the B-24 became a trusted partner. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a waist gunner with the 15th Air Force, put it this way: "She wasn't pretty, and she wasn't easy, but that Liberator brought us home when everything else had failed. I'll take performance over beauty any day of the week." By war's end, more than 18,000 B-24s had been produced, more than any other American bomber. They had flown in every theater, carried out every conceivable mission, and proven that sometimes the most effective weapons are those that prioritize capability over aesthetics. To understand the German approach to bomber design, we must shift our perspective entirely. Where American and British designers created specialized aircraft for specific roles, German engineers embraced a philosophy of versatility, building aircraft that could adapt to multiple missions as the war's demands changed. No aircraft embodied this approach more completely than the Junkers Ju-88. The Ju-88 began life as a medium bomber, but it would serve the Luftwaffe in more roles than any other aircraft in history. Day bomber, night bomber, dive bomber, heavy fighter, night fighter, reconnaissance aircraft, and even as a flying bomb in the war's desperate final stages. If the B-24 was versatile, the Ju-88 was a chameleon. This adaptability reflected the harsh realities facing the German war machine. Unlike the Allies, who could afford to develop specialized aircraft for specific roles, Germany needed maximum efficiency from every design. The Ju-88's basic airframe had to serve wherever the Luftwaffe needed it most, adapting to changing tactical requirements as the war progressed. The aircraft's most famous role came during the Battle of Britain, when Ju-88s formed the backbone of the Luftwaffe's bombing offensive against British targets. Flying in daylight formations that reminded observers of the American approach, these German bombers struck at British airfields, radar stations, and industrial targets with precision that impressed even their enemies. Wing Commander Douglas Bader, the legendary RAF fighter ace, had grudging respect for the Ju-88 crews he faced over Britain. They were good, no question about it. The 88 was fast enough to give our Spitfires a real chase, and those German crews knew how to use that speed. When they got into trouble, they could dive away from almost anything we could throw at them. But it was as the war progressed that the Ju-88 truly proved its worth. As the Luftwaffe found itself increasingly on the defensive, the aircraft's ability to adapt to new roles became crucial. Modified with radar and additional armament, Ju-88s became some of the most effective night fighters in the German inventory, hunting RAF bombers over the darkened skies of occupied Europe. Major Werner Streib, one of Germany's most successful night fighter pilots, flew Ju-88s on dozens of intercept missions. His description captures the deadly game of cat and mouse played out at high altitude. You would follow the British bombers for miles, staying just outside their defensive fire range, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The 88 gave you that patience. It could cruise efficiently at any altitude, giving you time to set up the perfect attack. The night-fighting Ju-88s were equipped with innovative Schrägmusik installations, upward-firing cannon that allowed German pilots to attack British bombers from below, where most defensive armament couldn't reach. This tactical innovation, combined with increasingly sophisticated radar systems, made the Ju-88 one of the most feared aircraft in European skies. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Ju-88 was how it adapted to Germany's changing strategic position. As the war turned against the Reich, Ju-88s found themselves pressed into roles never envisioned by their original designers. They became tank busters on the Eastern Front, anti-shipping aircraft over the Mediterranean, and desperate interceptors trying to stop the growing tide of Allied bombers. The aircraft's final, most desperate role came in 1944, when Ju-88s were converted into manned-flying bombs for the Mistel program. A fighter aircraft would be mounted on top of a Ju-88 packed with explosives, with the pilot using the combination as a weapon against Allied shipping and bridges. It was a testament to both German ingenuity and growing desperation. Throughout all these roles, the Ju-88 maintained a reputation for reliability and effectiveness that earned it respect from both sides. Allied intelligence reports consistently rated it as one of the most dangerous aircraft in the German inventory, precisely because its versatility made it unpredictable. By war's end, over 15,000 Ju-88s had been produced, serving in every theater where German forces operated. They had proven that, in total war, adaptability could be more valuable than specialization. The Ju-88 was never the best aircraft in any single role, but it was good enough in every role to make a difference. Some aircraft are remembered for their technical innovation, others for their strategic impact. But one German bomber is remembered for something far more visceral: the sheer terror it could inspire in those who heard its distinctive screaming dive. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka. Slow, vulnerable, and obsolete by 1942, yet so effective in its primary role that it revolutionized ground attack warfare. The Stuka's secret weapon wasn't its bomb load, which was modest, or its speed, which was pedestrian. No, the Stuka's weapon was psychological warfare raised to an art form. Those distinctive Jericho trumpets, sirens mounted on the aircraft's landing gear, announced the Stuka's arrival with a sound that seemed to come from hell itself. Picture this: Poland, September 1939. German armor is advancing across the Polish countryside, but ahead lies a bridge defended by determined Polish troops. Conventional artillery might damage the bridge, making it useless to the advancing Germans. But then, from the morning sky, comes that unmistakable sound. A banshee wail that grows louder and more terrifying with each passing second. The Stukas appear as tiny dots, then grow rapidly larger as they enter their characteristic near-vertical dive. At the last possible moment, they release their bombs with pinpoint accuracy, the explosions sending defenders scattering in panic. The bridge remains intact but abandoned. The German advance continues without pause. This was blitzkrieg warfare at its most effective. Not just the physical destruction of enemy positions, but the complete psychological domination of the battlefield. Stuka pilots didn't just destroy targets. They destroyed enemy morale, creating panic that spread far beyond the immediate area of attack. Hans-Ulrich Rudel, the most successful Stuka pilot in history, flew over 2,500 combat sorties and destroyed 519 tanks, 70 landing craft, 2 cruisers, a destroyer, and a battleship. His description of a typical dive attack captures the Stuka's unique combination of precision and terror. You push the aircraft into a dive so steep, it feels like falling off a cliff. The speed builds until the whole aircraft is shaking, the sirens screaming. You hold that dive until the target fills your entire field of vision, then release and pull out so hard you can barely stay conscious. The Stuka's effectiveness during the early war years was undeniable. In Poland, France, and the early stages of the Russian campaign, these dive bombers proved that precision air support could be the decisive factor in ground operations. They turned tanks into burning hulks, reduced fortifications to rubble, and broke infantry formations before ground troops even made contact. But the Stuka's greatest strength, its specialization, would also become its fatal weakness. As Allied fighter opposition intensified, the Stuka's slow speed and poor maneuverability made it easy prey for modern fighters. The same aircraft that had terrorized Poland and France became sitting ducks over Britain and Russia. The Battle of Britain marked the beginning of the end for the Stuka as a strategic weapon. RAF fighters found the diving junkers almost too easy to intercept. Stuka losses became so severe that the aircraft was withdrawn from operations over Britain after just a few weeks of combat. Yet even in its decline, the Stuka continued to serve. On the Eastern Front, where air superiority was contested rather than absolute, Stukas found new life in the tank-busting role. Armed with 37mm cannon, they became flying anti-tank guns, striking Soviet armor with devastating effectiveness. The aircraft's final contribution to military history might be its most important. It proved that precision air support, properly coordinated with ground forces, could be decisive in modern warfare. Every close air support aircraft that followed, from the American P-47 Thunderbolt to the modern A-10 Warthog, owes a debt to the lessons learned from the Stuka's successes and failures. The Ju-87 Stuka was never just an aircraft. It was a weapon system that combined technology, tactics, and psychology into something uniquely terrifying. In the annals of military aviation, it stands as proof that sometimes the most effective weapons are those that attack the mind as much as the body. As we reach the end of our journey through the deadly skies of World War II, we're left with a sobering realization. These bombers, these machines of war, were more than just weapons. They were the instruments through which ordinary young men performed extraordinary acts of courage, facing death on a daily basis in service to causes they believed were greater than themselves. The statistics alone tell a story that staggers the imagination. RAF Bomber Command lost 55,573 aircrew killed in action, a casualty rate higher than any other branch of the British military. The U.S. Army Air Forces lost over 40,000 men in the European theater alone. For every bomb that fell on enemy targets, the price was measured in the lives of young men who would never see their homes again. Yet they kept flying. In their Lancasters and Flying Fortresses, in their Wellingtons and Mitchells, in their Liberators and Stukas, they climbed into aluminum cockpits night after night, day after day, knowing that each mission might be their last. They did it not because they were fearless, many were terrified, but because they understood that the cause they served was worth any sacrifice. These aircraft changed warfare forever. They proved that no target, no matter how distant or well-defended, was beyond reach. They demonstrated that industrial capacity could be as decisive as battlefield courage. They showed that the home front and the battlefront were no longer separate concepts. In total war, everywhere became a battlefield. But perhaps most importantly, they revealed something profound about human nature itself. In the hands of brave crews, these bombers became instruments of liberation, freeing occupied nations, destroying the machinery of tyranny, hastening the end of a war that threatened to engulf civilization itself. Today, when we see the few surviving bombers at air shows, gleaming in the sunlight as they make their ceremonial passes, it's easy to forget the terror and destruction they once represented. But we must remember not just the machines, but the men who flew them. We must remember not just their victories, but their sacrifices. The deadliest bombers of World War II earned their fearsome reputation through the courage of their crews and the skill of their designers. They remind us that in humanity's darkest hour, ordinary people found the strength to do extraordinary things. They flew into the teeth of death itself, carrying with them the hopes of free nations and the promise of a better tomorrow. Their legacy lives on, not in the destruction they wreaked, but in the freedom they helped secure. For that, we will remember them.